Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anurekha Chariwag, Department of Sociology, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. I am coordinating the paper on Sociology of Gender. Today, the module that we are going to discuss is titled Citizenship, Political Representation and Reservation for Women. In this module, we will familiarize the students into the various debates of citizenship, political representation and reservation for women. And we will also discuss about the whole idea in terms of decentralization of power expressed in terms of Panchayati Raj institutions in India. Further, we will also discuss the way Constitution of India structures and frames access of rights for women. Further, we will also delve into caste, class and gender interlinkages in the context of patriarchy. Backdrop. Citizenship entails political rights and entitlements which are inalienable to any other individual, either man or woman. These are guaranteed by the supreme sovereign political body, that is the state. These rights, duties and entitlements are primarily political in nature, have their social and economic underpinnings too. Women's political participation and representation entails a wide range of activities, starting from becoming politically aware of the rights and responsibilities, participating in the electoral processes, voting and contesting in elections, and further maturing into emancipation of women. The political empowerment of women is a necessary condition for any kind of political system to function properly and efficiently. As a corollary of the same, it also minimizes the existing gender imbalances in the society. In this regard, initiatives world over have been taken to promote political participation of women in respective countries. In this context, Mary John has argued that securing the participation of women in the institutions of democracy and governance is now an important item on the global agenda. Article 7 of the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women (CEDAW), adopted in 1979 by the UN General Assembly, instructs state parties to take all appropriate measures to eliminate discrimination against women in the political and public life of the country. It ensures women on equal terms with men the right to vote in all elections and public referenda and be eligible for election to all publicly elected bodies, to participate in the formulation of the government policy and implementation thereof, and to hold public office and perform all public functions at all levels of government, and C, to participate in non-governmental organizations and associations concerned with public and the political life of the country. Report of the Fourth World Congress on Women, Beijing, 14 to 15 September 1995, states that without the active participation of women and the incorporation of women's perspective at all levels of decision making, the goals of equality, development, peace cannot be achieved, and spells out two important strategic objectives to be achieved. These are: 1. To take measures to ensure women's equal access to and full participation in power structures and decision making, and 2. To increase women's capacity to participate in decision making and leadership. The need for increased political participation has also given due space in Millennium Development Goals, and especially in Goal 3, which speaks of promoting gender equality and empowering women by taking into account proportion of seats held by women in national parliament. Asserting citizenship and political rights, women in colonial India. In India, according to Sen, women's participation in the political life of present day India dates back to the early 20th century, when organizations such as Women's India Association, National Council of Indian Women and the All India Women's Conference were formed in 1917, 1926 and 1927 respectively. The struggle for freedom from British rule provided further impetus to the women's emancipation in the pre-independence period, as a gradual transfer of power from the British to Indian hands gave women experience in participating in the democratic process. Mass mobilization and participation of women in the public arena gave birth to a vibrant chain of women activists who soon crossed the boundary of nationalism and seriously focused on women issues. A significant event was the formation of Indian National Congress in 1885 and participation of women in its meetings. The earliest record mentioned delegates like Swaran Kumari Ghoshal, Kadambari Ganguly attending the Indian National Congress meeting. Women along with men protested against the partition of Bengal in 1905. In December 1917, Sarojini Naidu along with other women met Mr. Montagu on the constitutional reform demanding voting rights for Indian women. As a result of conscious efforts by such women, the All India Women's Conference AIWC was formed in 1926 to 27. Among its many agendas, the issue of women's suffrage was a prime one. The Indian National Congress, in its 45th session at Karachi 1931, adopted Fundamental Rights of Citizenship, where it committed itself to women's equality, was largely an outcome of the mass participation of women in the national movement, as well as activities of several women's organizations, notably the AIWC, the WIA, and the NFIW, who had pioneered the first women's movement in India. Consequently, AICC passed a special resolution marking women's contribution in the 1930 Satyagraha. Although the British government turned down the demand for women's franchise in 1931, the Karachi session of the Indian National Congress resolved in favor of women's franchise and representation. During this period, various women's organizations were formed. D. Jinnah Raja Dasa, along with Annie Besant and Margaret Cousins, established the Women's India Association in 1917. Later on, the National Council for Women came to existence in 1925. All India Women's Conference in 1927 focused on women's education and recognized child marriage as root cause of women's status in India. It was the most visible organization along these. Thus, on the whole, women's and the social reform movement of the late 19th and the early 20th century also included political rights to franchise and representation. The Government of India Act of 1935 did provided a wider section of women's right to vote and contest election, but it was still demarcated by various eligibility criteria as literacy, property ownership, or marriage to propertied men. Women's citizenship and political representation in post-independent India. The Constitution of India, through its preamble, fundamental rights, fundamental duties, and directive principles, aims for socio-political empowerment of women. Some of these are equality before law for women, and the state not to discriminate against any citizen on the grounds only of religion, race, caste, sex, place of birth, or any of them. State is to make special provision in favor of women and children. Among others, Article 16 states that there shall be equality of opportunity for all citizens in matters relating to employment or appointment to any office under the state. Section 16(2) further states, no citizen shall, on the grounds of only sex, be ineligible for or discriminated against in respect of any employment or office under the state. Thus, the issue of enhancing women's representation in the legislatures is very much in the line of constitutional provisions. Although Articles 325 and 326 of the Indian Constitution guarantee political equality to all, yet women have not benefited from this right to the optimum. The National Policy for the Empowerment of Women 2001 also commits to affirmative actions such as reservation quotas, including in higher legislative bodies, will be considered whenever necessary on a time-bound basis. In 1967, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. On 22nd September 1971, National Committee on the Status of Women in India (CSWI) was appointed by the Ministry of Education and Social Welfare, Government of India. The commission had Full Renu Guha, Lotika Sarkar, Urmila Haskar, Veena Mazumdar as its member secretary. This move was a response to the United Nations initiative regarding the status of women's report for the International Women's Year in 1975. The committee, in its report titled Towards Equality, the report of the Committee on the Status of Women in India, 1974 to 75, among many things, drew attention to some of the alarming facts with regard to employment, political participation, and health status of the Indian women. Additionally, it called attention to existing inequality in education, income, access to health care, and political representation. Mazumdar, in her Memoirs of a Rolling Stone, has pointed out how Towards Equality report had also highlighted the issue of continued underrepresentation of women in the decision-making process of the country, and states that the same can be seen as a sufficient indicator of the reluctance of our society to accept the principle of equal representation for women. 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment Acts, practicing citizenship at grassroots level. The National Perspective Plan for Women 1988 to 2000 acknowledged the problem of women's underrepresentation in political sphere and strongly recommended a 30% reservation in the local governance, that is Panchayat Zilla, in local municipal bodies. The Government of India thus initiated affirmative action in this regard and mooted the 30% reservation for women in these bodies. The 64th Constitutional Amendment in Parliament for the reservation in all panchayats, introduced in 1984, was defeated by united opposition. However, in 1993, the 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendments, which aimed to give the rightful share to women in grassroots democracy, were enacted. The 73rd Constitutional Amendment Act introduced not less than 33% reservation for women in the Panchayati Raj institutions in the rural areas. Similarly, the 74th Constitutional Amendment Act introduced similar reservation for women in Nagarapalika municipalities in towns and urban areas, as a result of which there are about 1 million elected women representatives in panchayats and municipal bodies in India. However, one needs to note that such provision still does not exist at state and central levels. Women's Reservation Bill, a checkered journey. One of the key features of the women's movement in India was a continuous demand of reservation for women in the state legislature and the parliament, as well as the inclusion of women in the political structure and the proportionate electoral participation will not only correct the existing gender gaps in the electoral arena and remove barriers and obstacles confronting them, but also bring gender issues to the forefront, leading to women's empowerment and advancement in the society in the long run. The National Commission for Women, along with several other women's organizations, revived a more systematic struggle for introduction and passing of Women's Reservation Bill in 1995. Several organizations like National Alliance of Women, National Federation of Indian Women, Joint Women's Program, All India Democratic Women's Association, among others, jointly struggled for women's equal political participation. The National Alliance of Women's Political Manifesto, March 1996, included a demand for 33% to 50% allocation of seats at all levels of decision-making bodies, from Gram Panchayat, Nagar Panchayat to the Lok Sabha. Cabinet with priority to women, SCs, STs, OBCs, urban poor and minorities, and 33% to 50% seats in political parties for women, among others. It was more in the line of argument given by Hassan that recognizing women as a disadvantaged group, reservations are necessary to expand equality of opportunity and to make real the formal equality given by the Constitution. The demand for Women's Reservation Bill was again visible in Women's Charter for the 16th Lok Sabha elections 2014. Regards the political representation of women, there still exist glass ceilings in state cabinets. The Hindu, 16 February 2015. According to the column, just 39 of the 568 ministers in the state governments are women. Furthermore, with all the state assemblies put together, 360 of the country's 4,120 MLAs, which equals to nearly 9%, are women. For instance, out of 30 women contestants who fought the 2014 assembly elections, only 2 have made it to the Jammu Kashmir State Legislative Assembly. 20 women, which is 7.2% of the state assembly, were elected to the Maharashtra Legislative Assembly in 2014 Vidhan Sabha elections in 2014. The only solace is Haryana State Assembly, wherein 13 candidates out of 116 won in 2014 State Assembly election. In 2005 Assembly poll, only 60 women candidates contested and 11 got elected, while in 2009, 68 women candidates were in the fray and 9 of them won, which is represented in terms of the table. The less proportion of political representation and participation as evident in the table can also be understood in terms of various problems faced by women in the electoral arena, both as a contestant as well as a campaigner. Basu argues that a major impediment to women's effective exercise of power in the panchayats is the growing violence, harassment and corruption that pervade the political process. Violence and killings, especially against the Dalit women, have been on the rise. It has been found that one of the key factors that determines that is women's high level of participation is casting their votes, is women's interest in politics. According to India report, there are various constraints that prevent women from effective participation at the local level. Most serious one is deeply entrenched patriarchal political structures as mentioned by a report by UNDP. According to baseline report 1998, main areas have been identified and presented as the disadvantages faced by women, leading to the low levels of political participation, access to resources and information awareness, control over resources and information, personal and familial support, socioeconomic factors, organizational infrastructure, cultural barriers, and law and politics. To correct the gender imbalance in the political arena, the one constitutional amendment bill, popularly known as the Women's Reservation Bill, was introduced in the Parliament on 12 September 1996 to insert 330 Article 1 having provision of 1/3 seat to be reserved for women in the House of the People, as a consequence of which 181 of the 543 seats in the Lok Sabha lower house would be reserved for women, which will be in addition to the 22.5% reservation of scheduled caste and scheduled tribe candidates. The passing of bill will be both as a means and aim of empowerment of women and will lead to greater political participation by the women. The Joint Select Committee in its report on 9 December 1996 recommended that other backward classes OBC's reservation for women be considered by the government. The proposed bill lapsed due to the dissolution of the 11th Lok Sabha. The bill was again brought before the House in the 12th Lok Sabha on 14 July 1998 as the Constitutional 84th Amendment Bill 1998. This also could not be materialized due to the dissolution of the 12th Lok Sabha. On 8 March 1999, several women's organizations demonstrated for immediate passage of the Women's Reservation Bill. Subsequently, the Constitution's 85th Amendment Bill 1999 was introduced on 23 December 1999 but was shelved due to lack of support for it. Mahila Maha Adhiveshan, organized by All India Democratic Women's Association in New Delhi in 1999, demanded fair political representation. No alternative to women's quota bill became the rallying point of women's group in 2000. A new front, Joint Action Front for Women, emerged out of the union of 40 women's organizations to further struggle for women's reservation bill. After its reintroduction on 5th May 2003, the passage of women's reservation bill was protested by many opposition political parties such as Rashtriya Janata Dal, Samajwadi Party, Bahujan Samaj Party, and certain sections of the ruling National Democratic Alliance, as it had no provision for reservation on a caste basis for other backward classes. It was only on 9th March 2010, as a result of continuous struggle by the women's movement and women's organization, the Constitution's 108th Amendment Bill, Women's Reservation Bill, was passed in the Rajya Sabha. Of the votes polled, 186 were in favor of the bill and only 1 was against. In the 245-member House with an effective strength of 243, the bill required support from at least 155 members, and the United Progressive Alliance had the clear support of 165. In the present form, its major provisions are: the Constitution's 108th Amendment Bill 2008 seeks to reserve 1/3 of all seats for women in the Lok Sabha and the state legislative assemblies. The allocation of reserved seats shall be determined by such authority as prescribed by the Parliament. 1/3 of the total number of seats reserved for the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes shall be reserved for women of those groups in the Lok Sabha and the legislative assemblies. Reserved seats may be allocated by rotation to different constituencies in the state or union territory. Reservation of seats for women shall cease to exist 15 years after the commencement of this Amendment Act. Still, the Women's Reservation Bill has to see its successful passage in the Lok Sabha. Impedance to the passage of Women's Reservation Bill, in spite of notable women parliamentarians, can be understood through a paradoxical situation wherein female participation in higher levels of political process seems to be confined to women from families with a political tradition, except who enjoys reservation in both the state and central legislatures. Similar arguments have been posed by Basu, for whom the power of women MPs is generally very limited, because they are expected to support the party line rather than formulate their own agendas. They have accorded low priority to issues concerning women. Similarly, Rai has pointed out that the women head a significant number of national and state level political parties. As party leaders, their representation within the rank and file of prominent political parties is not in significant numbers. locating Women's Reservation Bill in caste and class milieu. The debates surrounding Women's Reservation Bill not only bring out the way patriarchy operates in Indian society, but also brings the citizenship of women into question. As Kannaviran have argued, that the crux of the matter is that if women actually manage to push the legislation through, what it is at stake is the political basis of male politicians across board and the socio-political hegemonies in the existing social order. Similarly, Menon has argued that there are feminist or at least pro-women arguments for and against reservations for women, and implicitly or explicitly caste-based arguments for and against. Needless to say, such deliberations are also marked by deep caste and class factionalism as well as chasm between the urban and rural divide. The opposition to the proposed WRB, which is Women's Reservation Bill, does not come from the outside. It also has its fair share of insiders, that is, academicians and activists engaged in the feminist thinking. The provisions of reserving the seats not taking into account the OBC population is one point. Additively, the rotation of reserved constituencies every 5 years is also critical, as it is a major obstacle to establishment of nurturing relationship between elected women and the respective constituencies. It is very interesting to note that there were very few protests and resistance to the successful passage of the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments in comparison to Women Reservation Bill. In this regard, Sonalkar has argued that as logic of decentralization of power does not apply to the issue of reservation for women in the national and state level political elected bodies. It is very difficult to convince the opposition to arrive at the consensus for the successful passage of the Women's Reservation Bill. The introduction of Women's Reservation Bill has led to debates across socio-political spectrum and once again throws up the questions of certain kinds of identity, especially caste and religious identity, their intermeshing of gender identity with caste and religion, and the articulation in the public realm and in the field of politics. At the same time, it needs to be underlined that almost all political parties have supported the Women's Reservation Bill right from 1996 onwards, either including it in the common minimal program or agendas for election. Menon has argued that positions on the Women's Reservation Bill throws into a belief a set of interrelated questions about women as a subject of feminist politics, citizenship in post-colonial democracy, and the idea of political representation. Similarly, a research paper by PRS Legislative Research titled Legislative Brief, The Constitution 108th Amendment Bill 2008 by Kaushiki Sanyal states that the issue of reservation of seats for women in Parliament can be examined from three perspectives: whether the policy of reservation for women act as an effective instrument of empowerment, whether alternative methods of increasing representation of women in Parliament are feasible, and whether issues in the bill need to be examined. Gupta has briefly summarized the views both for and against the Women Reservation Bill. Caste-based arguments against the Women Reservation Bill takes positions for and against reservation explicitly or implicitly in terms of caste as a source of much opposition with the men from the backward caste. The male leaders fear the reservation for women would give many of the seats to upper caste women and called for quotas within quotas, arguing that since women are not homogeneous mass, quotas within quotas could meaningfully include more disadvantaged among women. Quota within quota broadly means sub-reservation for ST, SCs and OBCs and minority communities within the 33% quota. However, the position of quota within quota is seen by Hassan as a politics of competing identities of caste and community and women. Pointing out to the class dimension, the Women's Reservation Bill has been questioned on the ground of whether or not it would simply provide more room for elite women to gain seats or would encompass women from a range of backgrounds. Political leaders, even from supposedly liberal parties and media, have tended to present the debate as one of gender versus caste. For Randall, explanations of the failure to pass the bill point to a number of relevant factors, including the problems of within the quota proposal itself, division and elitism of the women's movement, and the distance between women's politicians and women at large, and the simple reflexes of inconstant patriarchy. Women Reservation Bill barriers and alternatives. In the last 2 or 3 decades, there has been an argument outlining the second democratic upsurge, wherein the huge gap that existed earlier between male and female turnout has been nearly closed now. Similarly, the study done by Kapoor and Ravi also reveals a sharp decline in the gender bias in voting over time across all states, including traditionally backward states. Yet such an upsurge still needs to be translated in women being elected, as the most women continue to lack effective political power in parties and the state. Women access to power is still mediated by the relationship to male kin and is often indirect and symbolic. Parties have done little to provide access to the networks and resources that would enable them to ascend the ranks of party hierarchies. The same argument has been forwarded by Million Development Goals India Country Report 2005, wherein it says that although increasingly women have stood for elections and have got elected as members of the state legislative assemblies and parliament, the number of women parliamentarians is not of the expected level. Under the broad rubric of civil and political rights, there has emerged an alternative to Women's Reservation Bill proposed by a Forum of Democratic Reforms. Forum for Democratic Reform terms it as an alternative to the government bill for women's reservation, which Hassan has termed it as pro-woman but against reservation. Some of his provisions are to make it mandatory for every recognized political party to nominate women candidates for election in 1/3 of its constituencies. Each party can choose where it wishes to nominate women candidates, usually taking local political and social factors into account. Among the seats reserved for STs and STs also, 1/3 of the candidates nominated by recognized parties shall be women. In proposing this, Forum argues that in this, any woman candidate will not be seen as a proxy of a political affiliation, rather she will be contesting the election purely on her merit. This will increase her acceptance in the larger body politic. However, the suggestion of amending Representation of People Act (RPA) and making mandatory for political parties to give a fixed percentage of seats for women candidates was refused by several women's organizations, as women candidates might be fielded from defeat-prone and violence-marred constituencies. Another alternative proposed in July 2003 intended to create dual-member constituencies in 1/3 of all electoral districts. In this process, will increase the total number of seats in the parliament by 181. This will result in election of one man, one woman from these particular constituencies. Nani Wadekar argues that the new proposal for converting 1/3 Lok Sabha constituencies into dual-member constituencies, assuring men their existing share of pie, seemingly holds a much-needed promise for resolving the deadlock over women's reservation. The new proposal has yet another advantage, that of increasing the number of representatives without lifting the freeze on delimitation. Additively, the creation of dual-member constituencies will not restrict the choice of voters, as they will have two candidates to vote for. This might lessen the heartburn of the male candidates, as they will not feel being discriminated. However, one of the strong critiques of the system is that given the socio-political setup of Indian society, women candidates may become second fiddle to the male candidates. However, the creation of the dual-member constituencies will take time, as due to the 84th Constitutional Amendment under the Parliament seats has been frozen until 2026. All India Democratic Women's Association, in its memorandum from women's organizations to the Prime Minister on reservation for women in Parliament and legislatures, August 2003, strongly opposed the proposal of double-member constituencies on various grounds. In this module titled Citizenship, Political Representation and Reservation for Women, we had discussed a basic knowledge of citizenship rights. We also focused on entitlements to citizenship rights. Further, after discussing this whole idea about citizenship rights, we also focused on the interlinkages in terms of political sphere with gender equality. Further, we have also focused on the idea and dynamics of citizenship rights in the context of participation, campaigning, contesting and voting. Thank you.